Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Chantel, and today I'm going to be doing another book review, slightly more in-depth individual book review. The last one I did was on The Warm Hands of Ghosts by Catherine Arden, and I think that went over pretty well. I'm pretty pleased with it, so I'm going to continue doing them, at least for the moment. So I finished another book recently that I am interested in talking about with a little bit more depth, and that is Cleopatra, A Life by Stacy Schiff. So this is the biography of Cleopatra from this is almost 15 years old now, I think. As I said in a previous, had this sitting on my shelf for a long time, and I finally decided to read it as part of the Historathon 2024 read-along, reading challenge, whatever, as a first quarter read, because this is a pre-500 AD story, the story of Cleopatra. She lived a couple of decades before Christ. So, yeah, so I read this biography, and I'd like to get into it a little bit. I did really enjoy this book. I think first and foremost, Stacy Schiff is an excellent writer. My cat agrees. So yeah, she's a very, very good writer. If you're looking for something that is very readable and very, I would call this immersive, frankly, then this is definitely a good way to go. Yeah, Schiff is incredibly good at painting a picture of a time and place, a very specific time and place. So I think that's really, like, first and foremost, that's the thing that I want to say about this book. And I mean, the other thing to say about this book is that, of course, the sources for Cleopatra's life, the events of her life, are sparse, to say the least. And what we do have is almost entirely written by men who absolutely despised her, and written by and they're coming from a culture which generally very much despised women, and especially despised women who attempted to wield any kind of power. And so and Schiff, obviously talks a lot about this in the book. It's like, it's the first thing you really need to know if you're going to try to read about Cleopatra or learn about Cleopatra's life, is that we don't really have any accounts of her life written either by her or by people who liked her, who knew her personally and also liked her. They really don't exist. If they ever did exist, they certainly have not survived 2,000 years. So it can be very difficult at points to suss out what may have actually been happening, to cut through the propaganda, because again, a lot of what was written about her, particularly after her death, was very much propaganda. It was anti-Cleopatra propaganda, it was anti-Mark Antony propaganda, and it was very much, Augustus trying to sort of craft a very particular narrative of what he did and why he did it, for posterity. It's very much a case of history is written by the winners, and ultimately Cleopatra was not a winner, not long term anyway, right? Long term, she and Mark Antony lost, and so everything written about her is written through that lens of she lost, and the people who beat her are now the ones writing about her life. And Stacy Schiff really makes this clear. I do also think that I get the feeling at times that Schiff is writing from a perspective of a kind of third wave feminism that is very, very reluctant, I would say, to even consider talking about women using their sexuality as a means of gaining power for themselves or for others. She does at times seem a little bit reluctant to give Cleopatra that motivation, which I think is really, sometimes is a little bit like, I completely understand this idea of like wanting to reclaim Cleopatra from all these misogynist men who absolutely despised her and basically spent 2,000 years calling her a slut and a whore, and wanting to talk about like the ways in which she was clearly a very intelligent political strategist. So I completely understand that sense of wanting to reclaim her as, you know, a political figure, as someone who wasn't just defined by the men that she slept with, right? But there are a couple of times where it's like Cleopatra clearly did willingly and knowingly use her sexuality to get things, right? To accomplish her goals. And like, that's okay that she did that. Like, it's not like, we don't have to act like that was evil of her or that she's an evil slut for doing it. But like, it's okay to acknowledge that she did it too, right? Like, it's fine. That's kind of a historical fact, right? Like, she had a child with Julius Caesar. She had 3 children with Mark Antony. It's okay to acknowledge that she is someone who did that, and that she is both, right? That she's both a woman who obviously did use her sexuality to like played different sides and get what she wanted politically, but she's also very much like an astute political actor in her own right, and she's doing things, she's running a country, she is the sovereign ruler of Egypt, and she's very wealthy, and she understands all of these other things. My cat is really being very distracting tonight. So I think that's, you know, I don't know. I maybe get the feeling that this is maybe a relic of the fact that this was written in the late aughts. um, and if maybe if this had been written more recently, maybe it would be a little bit easier, or she would be a little bit less reluctant to ascribe these things to Cleopatra. But given all that, and given the fact that it is really impossible to completely comprehend the motives and inner feelings and thoughts of people who lived 2,000 years ago, especially when we do not have written first-person accounts from them, I think she does a very good job of crafting this narrative and helping us to contextualize some of the things that are going on beyond simply that Cleopatra seduced Julius Caesar, and then Julius Caesar was killed, and then Cleopatra seduced Mark Antony, and then they died. Like, she's definitely contextualizing this in within the ancient world and within the sort of late Roman Republic, and helping the reader to understand like what all of this means and where Egypt sat within this sort of constellation. Because, you know, again, Cleopatra is very much like attempting to maintain her sovereignty and the sovereignty of Egypt, which at this point is already a very, very old kingdom in the world, but which has been in decline for quite a while and is now sort of becoming this Roman vassal state. And she's attempting to maintain a certain amount of autonomy for Egypt throughout her lifetime. Unfortunately, after her death, of course, she loses that battle, and Egypt eventually becomes, you know, part of the Roman Empire. So that's, you know, a really interesting aspect of this book, I think. She's also, I also really enjoyed the discussions that she has about Cleopatra's relationships with other rulers in the region, particularly with King Herod of Judea, who was also a sort of vassal king of the Roman Republic and owed his throne to the Romans. And their very rocky relationship and what that meant and how that contributed to the ways in which she was betrayed and how she and Mark Antony eventually lost everything. I thought that was really interesting. And again, it adds a little bit more depth, a little bit more context to the overall narrative of Cleopatra's life, right? Because this, this image that we have of Cleopatra is basically Elizabeth Taylor's Cleopatra, right? And it's very sumptuous, it's very sexual, and, it's not necessarily wrong, but there's more to it than that. It's more complicated, and Schiff does a very good job of complicating these images that we have of her. Yeah, I also, really enjoyed the way that she, the relevance that a lot of this still has to us today, of course, because a big part of the reason why Cleopatra still holds so much interest for us today, I think, is in large part because Western society has not changed a lot since her time. Like she talks, Schiff talks a lot about how the Romans viewed Egypt and the East, right? Like as it's very, they tended to exoticize it, they tended to feminize it, they tended to have all of these ideas about it that are based in their very specific patriarchal culture. And a lot of those things are still true of Western society. We pull a lot of our cultural mores come from that sort of general idea. And so we in the West, in sort of the English speaking world in Western Europe and the America, we still exoticize and feminize the East, the East, the Middle East, Northern Africa, that sort of general part of the world, in a lot of the same ways that the Romans did in, during Cleopatra's lifetime. And that's a big part of why we still are so fascinated by Cleopatra. And to some degree, I would say it does kind of implicate us in our continued weird cultural obsessions, frankly, which I think is, really interesting. But yeah, I mean, I think, my favorite thing about this book is probably that Stacy Schiff just really does a good job of describing the world that Cleopatra inhabited, particularly the city of Alexandria, which was, vastly different from how it is today. And it was arguably one of the greatest cities in the world during Cleopatra's lifetime. It was certainly one of the wealthiest. It contained, Egypt contained multiple ancient wonders of the world. Alexandria had, of course, the lighthouse. There was the Library of Alexandria. The palace was huge and sumptuous. The city was gorgeous, and she contrasts it very effectively with this image of Rome during the late Republic, because, of course, Cleopatra visited Rome and stayed with Julius Caesar for a time. And, describing the way that Rome was a sort of rabbit warren of back alleys and tenements, and it had none of the sort of grandiose architecture, or it had very little of the grandiose architecture that would come, because most of the grandiose architecture that we think of in Rome dates from the Empire, which is still to come. It's still in the future. So the contrast between Alexandria, this beautiful, well-planned, intellectual, wealthy city that was a bastion of, quote-unquote civilization, versus Rome, which at this point is still kind of a backwater, is really interesting, and is you know, really keeps the book very readable and very enjoyable. And she does a wonderful job with it. So yeah, that is that's about all I have to say about this book. I believe I gave it 4 stars on Storygraph. So yeah, that's Cleopatra. And I am glad that I got to it. I'm glad that I'm able to participate in Historathon 2024. I might try to sneak in one more book before the end of the month for the first quarter. We'll see. Probably if I do, it'll be an audiobook almost certainly. But yeah, I'm super glad to be doing this, and I'm really excited to look at some of the titles that I might want to do for quarter 2. I love the medieval period. I love the Middle Ages. And there's so many potential titles for quarter 2 that I have a bunch just on my TBR. I need to sort through and like figure out what I might want to pick up from the library, or even pick up at my local bookstore for quarter 2, because there's a lot of really fascinating potential titles for quarter 2. So that's that for that. That's my book review for the week. And yeah, so if you have read this biography of Cleopatra, and let me know in the comments what you thought of it, or if you're thinking about reading it. What other books are you reading for Historathon 2024 for the first quarter? I'd love to hear what those titles are, and how you're enjoying them. So go ahead and leave a comment below if you'd like. And yeah, we'll see you in the next video. Bye.